Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers, de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy. I am Jesse Martineau. Now, today's episode is going to be a unique episode for us. Development that's been really great has been the number of suggestions we get from listeners on guests we should have to the podcast. Well, today's guest actually was a very strong suggestion of two-time guest Juliana LaRue. Juliana told us that she had recently seen Dartmouth professor of English Ernest Hebert read his essay, Sister George and What's in a Name, and she said we absolutely had to see if we could get Ernest to read it on the podcast. So that's what we did. And we are incredibly excited to say that today we welcome Ernest Hebert to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. Now, Ernie Hebert is a writer of a dozen novels and a number of nonfiction works. He has been a reporter for the Keene Sentinel, a columnist for the Boston Globe. In 2006, he was chosen Fiction Writer of the Year by the New England Booksellers Association. He is a professor emeritus of English at Dartmouth College. Ernie, welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Hey, I'm so happy to be on this podcast.
Well, we're glad to have you. Can we start with your story? Maybe tell us where you grew up.
Oh, I grew up in Keene, New Hampshire. It's funny, I grew up a Hebert, but my parents spoke French in the house.
Sure.
And, of course, they didn't pronounce it Hebert. They pronounced it Hebert. Eventually, I went to South Louisiana, and there I became an Hebert. People would say, Hebert, that's a fine South Louisiana name. Nobody ever said Hebert, that's a fine New England name. So I was really, I felt like a little bit like royalty in South Louisiana.
Now, was there a large Franco population in Keene? We haven't heard the Keene story at all.
Well, you know, there is a real French Canadian presence in Keene, but it was not dominant in any way. There was one church, St. Bernard's Church. And the pastor was almost Irish, always an Irishman. And the Sisters of Mercy, of course, have their base. Their founder was Irish, so the Irish were the kind of dominant Catholic group, followed by the Italians.
Wow.
And then the French. We were number 3, and the Polish kids and the Lithuanians, they were distant down the road, you know. Gotcha.
So were there like French Franco-American organizations at all that your parents belonged to?
You know, there was we had a crisis point in my family when I was 5 years old. My parents, when my parents met, they spoke French to each other, and sure. French was the language of their romance. So as a result, they even though they were both living in Keene and lived like any other Anglo, they spoke French in the house, and so as their firstborn, that was the first language I learned.
Sure.
And I didn't know very much English, and when I went to kindergarten at Lincoln School in Keene. Something happened, and I couldn't tell you what it was. All I know is that when I came home, my parents told me later on that it was traumatic for me, and so they decided to stop speaking French in the house. And the result was I blew off French and never spoke it again.
That's wild. Now, did you guys...
That's kind of sad, you know?
It is very sad. Now, did you guys hang on to any of the Franco traditions? Like, did you guys have pork pie at events? Okay.
Oh, yeah. And I remember little swear words like
yes, absolutely.
La tête de pioche, you know, and I think I even get the accent right when I say it. But yeah. And of course my family was very heavily French. My uncle, Catholic priest I'm named after, was the pastor of St. Marie's Church in Manchester, New Hampshire, when he was a Monsignor. and he wanted to be bishop. So he was a real big shot in New Hampshire, New Hampshire Catholic hierarchy.
Yeah, I mean, obviously St. Marie's was noted as kind of like the go-to French Canadian church. Even though there was 8 of them, the one that everybody held up as like the French Canadian church was St. Marie's on the west side. That's very cool.
Yeah, it's I don't know what to think about this idea that the Catholics in New England should separate by their, there was there are Irish Catholics and
right.
Italian Catholics and French Catholics, and somehow they were as divided in their own way as anybody is.
You mentioned that your folks were born in this country, growing up speaking French. Were your grandparents? Were they the ones from Canada?
Yeah. My grandparents on both sides came from Canada, and among my father's side, my great grandfather and my great grandmother were both Heberts.
Wow.
And from the same town, so I don't know. Maybe they were related for all I know.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, that's funny.
And of course, I had a relative of mine did a genealogy and discovered, of course, all the Heberts come from old Acadia.
Sure. No, that's cool. Now, I read in some of your works that you are married. Now, is your go ahead.
I married Medora Lavoie or Lavoie.
Lavoie.
How you want to
yes.
say it? Yeah, she's from Dover, New Hampshire. We got married in 1969, so we celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary this year.
Well, congratulations. That's awesome.
Oh yeah.
Now, did she grow up speaking French?
Did she go? No.
Not at all. Okay.
No. It was in a way it was the same. It was almost the same story of very conscious of your heritage.
Sure.
But ignoring it as much as possible.
Gotcha. No, that's tough. Now, how about your daughters? Do they hang on to the heritage at all?
Well, in a small way. They didn't grow up Catholic because I rejected Catholicism. I think when I was 6.
Early on, okay.
I think some people I think are naturally religious and some people are not. Maybe it's a gene. I don't know, but I never have it. Even as a kid, I was not a believer. It all seemed kind of strange and ridiculous to me. The whole religion thing. But anyway, to go back to your question about my kids, both my daughters are very conscious of their heritage, but it doesn't play much into their lives. I will say that my daughter Nikki, who's a bartender in Brooklyn,
that's awesome.
Goes by Nicole Hebert in New York. She's an Hebert in New York.
Good for her. That's cool.
Yeah,
I like that. Now,
she's also a poet. She's a poet and a bartender.
Wow, well, it must be a lot. I bet she gets a lot of different things that she can work with in her day-to-day as a bartender. You run into a number of people, I would think. Various groups of people, too.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think to be a bartender, you have to be a kind of a method actor.
Yeah, if you're a good one, I think that's right. I own a documentary that New Hampshire PBS had put out about 20 years ago. It was called Franco-Americans We Remember, and it interviewed a number of people, and you were in it a bunch. Basically,
really?
telling your story.
Well, I've done a zillion interviews, and I can't remember that one.
That's awesome.
In fact, I don't remember most of them. I find that when I am talking, not much remains later on. I'm much better when I'm the audience than when I'm the headliner.
Sure. Well, the reason I was bringing this up is because you did tell a pretty cool story about your dad and about what he did for work and what his work schedule looked like and what his life at his job looked like. And I wonder if you could maybe explain that for us.
Oh, yeah. Well, my dad, my dad was a quiet man. He only had 6, 7, or 8 years of education. He was never quite sure himself.
Wow.
when he left grammar school, and he worked in a cotton mill as a weaver, and he worked 55 hours a week, 1 week days, 1 week nights for 45 years. and he was tired all the time.
Sure.
And so it was exhausting work, and I can remember between my junior and senior year in high school, I wanted to play baseball, Babe Ruth baseball.
Sure.
But my dad said, no, I want you to work in the mill with me.
Oh, wow.
And so he put me to work there for the same hours that he worked, 55 hours a week,
Yeah.
in this incredible sweatshop. It was the most purgatorial work I've ever done in my life. And I did it for one summer. He did it for 45 years. And at the end of the summer, he said, well, how'd you like working in the shop? I said, well, I didn't like it at all.
Right.
And he said, good. He said, I don't ever want to see you back here.
That's awesome. See, that reminds me of something. My mom's father worked 40 plus years in the mills in Manchester. And so my mom also, actually, she would do the full-time shift when she was in high school. She'd go during the day and then do the 3 to 11 at the mill at night. And I remember her once telling me that was the greatest motivator she ever had to make sure to go to college. So I thought
Really? That's good.
Yeah.
Did you say Manchester?
Yes, sir.
You're a Manchester boy?
Absolutely.
Manchester, New Hampshire?
Manchester, New Hampshire. St. George Church on Pine Street was where my family was
kidding.
from. Yes, sir.
Who knows? We may be related or something.
We probably know similar people anyway.
Yeah, my mother, grew up on the West Side. With all,
Yeah.
Anyway, I still have Manchester friends. Bob Perot, who's one of my heroes.
Yeah.
Do you know Bob?
Oh, we had him on the show. He is, I refer to him as a legend. He is absolutely like somebody those of us growing up in Manchester look up to beyond belief. To me, he was the first one that told our story. Like I learned in school, that, there's this history that happened in Boston, maybe even a little bit on the seacoast. But then I got to pick up a Robert Perrault book, and I thought it was the greatest thing ever. And I still do. Anytime I get the chance to see him speak, my parents get a chance to see him speak, we are there. He's the best.
Well, he's the one who raised my consciousness. I was kind of away from the whole Frenchy thing until I must have been in my 50s when I met Bob, and he totally turned my life upside down.
That's awesome.
In a good way.
Yeah, let's hope so. But yeah, it's funny though you mentioned.
It even had an effect on my books. My main character in my I have 7 interconnected novels about one New Hampshire town, Darby, New Hampshire.
Right.
And Howard Ellman, who's a working man, is the protagonist for the first book, and the seventh book is a very, very important character. And so he's a kind of a Yankee kind of guy. But thanks to Bob, I decided, I think I'm going to make some changes here. So in the 6th book, which I call Spoonwood, Howard's son does some research and discovers that Howard, who's a foundling, by the way, he didn't know where he came from. His name is actually Latour. so I finally brought in some little bit of French background, but it took me 6 books to get there.
Yeah, you got there though. I like that. Going back to your work, you have a great quote on your Dartmouth page, and I want to make sure I get this right. It's been my mission as a novelist to write about the working people without idealizing or demeaning them, and without standing them up against the wall to represent some political ideology or notion of the author. I'm especially interested in the interior lives of working people, a territory ignored by most literary writers. And I made sure to write that down because I'm curious what your growing up in Keene, son of a mill worker, living that French-Canadian experience in your house impacted your writing?
Well, I'm not sure. That was all kind of integrated, but I think this is kind of hard to explain. But for me, it was a kind of naivete about the world. My parents were very, very good, decent people, but they were very insular. It was all about family, and they had very few friends in the outside world, and so I actually didn't know very much about the outside world. It wasn't until I went in the Army, and then later went to work for the Funk that I began to have a clearer understanding things like, like a steak, for example. I had my first steak when I was 18 years old at Valley Steakhouse, and it had some pink in it, and I thought, this is so tasty. How come I never? My parents never had steak.
That's awesome.
My father would not eat meat that wasn't well done, and so a lot of my life had to do with discovering the outside world, because I never knew much about it.
Now, it's funny, we've talked about your pops a couple of times, and I'm curious, because one thing that my grandfather always stressed, he worked crazy hours in the mill himself, but he, without question, absolutely loved his job, which I thought was
He loved his job. What did he do?
He loved it. He was a loom fixer.
A loom fixer. Okay.
Yeah, and again, because to him it was like it was a trade. It was something he had to be trained to do. He got to work with his hands. He was respected as somebody who could fix things when they went down. And he took kind of pride in all of that. So I'm guessing that your dad was not as thrilled with his life, with his occupation.
No, but he never complained about it. He never complained about it. But I will tell you a story. I think that is relative to your father's story, which was that my dad always had long fingernails, and he was very careful about keeping his hands soft. He used my mother's hand lotion,
Sure.
And the summer I worked in the mill with him, he ran a whole bunch of machines, and of course it was all piecework.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Because these machines were running at the max, they were always breaking down. A thread would break down,
right?
And he had to watch them. And when a thread broke down, he had to shut the machine down and fix it. And he used those long fingernails in a way that I couldn't demonstrate to tie the knots that you needed to tie real fast.
Sure.
So they could get his machine going again.
No, that's so interesting. I mean, the conditions they had to work in. I don't think I can ever, having not been there, pictured it. I've heard the stories, I've read the stories, but I mean, you've seen it yourself. You knew what that was like.
Well, yeah. I mean, I know one thing that there's one thing that I believe in. It's OSHA.
Oh yeah, of course.
Before when I was in that shop before OSHA, there were big, huge gears always cranking around. There was a lot of crap floating in the air that make your eyes water. The place was dangerous.
Yeah, I can imagine. All right,
and there were always people getting hurt, I worked in a sawmill briefly, and I swear that 2/3 of the people, it was a furniture manufacturing, so there were a lot of open saws.
Sure.
And there were no guards or anything, and most of the people who worked there had a missing digit or two.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's terrifying. Your book series, your series of novels, and most biographies about you kind of start with those, the Darby Chronicles series. And I'm interested to find out why a series. Why did you plan it as a series right from the beginning? Did you always know it was going to be 7 novels?
Yeah, well, my first agent, Mavis McIntosh, who was one of the founders of McIntosh and Otis, the first all-woman agency in New York City, was a big deal, though I didn't know that at the time. She was an old lady. She told me, she said, "Young man, whatever you do, don't write a series. They'll only read the first one." And she was right. Only the Dogs of March has been a financial success. And that was a fairly modest one. But to go back to the essence of your question, I actually started a non-Darby book after I finished the Dogs of March, but I just couldn't get going on it. And after I completed the Dogs of March, there were a lot of unanswered questions that I had about the town and some of the characters, because I was writing the book from Howard Elman's perspective. So even though I had other characters, I didn't know with any depth what their stories were. But I was curious about them. So actually, it started with a curiosity about characters in the Dogs of March who were not the headliners.
Sure.
And so I wrote the second book, A Little More Than Kin. And then while I was writing the third book, Whisper My Name, I had this epiphany where I could see the next 2 books ahead of me. I actually had a rough plot line for The Passion of Estelle Jordan and Live Free or Die
Wow.
in my head. At the same time, I knew that these books were not going to make me rich by any stretch of the imagination. So I had to make a choice whether I wanted to remain writing the books that I wanted to write, or whether I wanted to make some money and try to write something more exciting.
Sure.
And I just couldn't help myself. I had to stick with my original plan. Luckily, I was able to get a good job. So, teaching. Yeah.
No, that's awesome.
So,
that's very cool.
So anyway, I stuck with my guns, and I've only written the books I wanted to write.
I like that a lot. Now, you mentioned that you had kind of discovered this plot line in your head for a couple of the books, which I think is kind of fun because you described that you don't normally start with the plot when you write a book.
No, I start with the character, and I started writing The Dogs of March by writing a day in his life. Now, I had the idea I had, which was that I wanted to write about a working man who was tough and tender in his heart, and that's all I knew. And so I didn't know what the story was. I just know I wanted to write about this character. I just wrote a day in his life, an ordinary day where everything goes wrong, and it's through that writing, which is in longhand, by the way, on a yellow legal notepad.
That's awesome.
Maybe 100 pages. It was through that exercise that I began to see some of the themes that would be in the book. And then to actually write the plot, I did something that I don't think many people do. I got in I had a little pickup truck, and I took off with one of those old-fashioned tape recorders that had big buttons.
Yes, absolutely.
And I talked into it, and so I wrote, and I drove all day, and I ended up in a campground in Delaware. Drove all day the next day, and by the time I got to New Mexico, I had a plot.
That's so great.
And I turned around and came home, and I plotted all my books on the road.
That's amazing. So every time you have a bunch of characters that you've developed, and you got to get in that automobile to figure out what exactly the story is going to be.
Well, you know, when you drive alone, you tend to scheme. Everybody does that, right? It's something you do. It's what you do when you're driving alone. Your mind schemes. Well, that's what plotting is. It's not writing, it's scheming. And so the road is actually kind of a natural place to do the kind of thinking you need to do to plot a book. It used to be I could write it off on my taxes as a road trip, and actually feel I justify it because I'm not exactly working.
Sure.
All the while I'm going. And the last book I wrote, the Howard Elman's Farewell. At the time, I was living in Westmoreland, New Hampshire, and working at Dartmouth College. And so I plotted that book, driving back and forth between Hanover and Westmoreland, New Hampshire.
That's awesome. Okay, so this interview has been way fun, but I'm super excited to have everybody hear this essay. Do you mind reading Sister George in What's in a Name for us?
Yes, I will read. I don't remember the exact year, but let's say it's around my fateful year of 1967 when my brother Tony, at age 24, and I, at age 26, are headed to St. Anselm College in Manchester, New Hampshire, to visit our aunt, Sister George. She's come down from Canada on some kind of Catholic church business, and my mother, who has been in touch with her oldest sibling by telephone, says that Sister George is eager to see us. She's a bit of a stranger to us. We haven't seen her since we were kids living in our parents' house on 19 Oak Street in Keene, New Hampshire, and only then on occasion in the brief time she was stationed at a parish relatively nearby in Nashua. What I remember most clearly about her is that she's tiny, even tinier than our mother. I also remember a cheerful smile, a shy demeanor, and that we never had a real conversation with her because we spoke different languages. Tony and I meet Sister George at St. A's in a room that looks like a chapel retrofitted into a space that my parents would refer to as a parlor. In a time when some nuns, including my cousin Anne, a sister of mercy with a PhD in education, are wearing civvies, Sister George is still in her full regalia, black habit, gold cross hanging from a pendant around her neck. As we enter, she looks very nervous but full of anticipation for our meeting. Her right hand clutches the crucifix that falls from the pendant to the middle of her chest. Such a tiny lady with such an exquisite face full of mirth. We hug her with care. She's so delicately constructed that we're afraid we'll crush her. After our hellos and her bonjour, we step back and there's an awkward silence. Finally, Sister George speaks her first words in English, a bit of slang she must have picked up during her visit at St. A's that she planned to show off just the right moment, and whose nuances of meaning have escaped her. With a sweeping gesture of a hand toward the chair, she says, "Park your ass." Our meeting with Sister George was brief. Nothing changed. We could not connect with her in our language, and she could not connect with us in hers. We never saw her again. 20 or so years after Tony and I visited her, Sister George retired to the house in Quebec. My mother didn't think she was getting health care, so she worked the phones trying to help her sister. It wasn't until after Sister George had died that my mother learned that the funeral mass had already been carried out and the body buried. Where is her grave? Somewhere in Canada. Now, in 2019, my aunt's order, the Sisters of Joan of Arc, has faded into obscurity. Here's some information I picked up dated August 2017 from Catholic Answers Forum. Quote, the Sisters of St. Joan of Arc, who are based in Quebec, closed all of their convents due to age and have just one in Canada. Their charisma was to minister in rectories. Their mother house was sold to a developer who turned the building into condos, unquote. I had never heard that word charisma used in that context before, so I looked it up. Secondary meaning, quote, a divinely conferred power or talent. What of that phrase, minister to rectories? What does it mean? It means the Sisters of St. Joan of Arc were cooks and maids at the residences of priests. I've heard people refer to such work as demeaning, but in my ethic, which I have adopted, there was no such a thing as demeaning work. There was only work in the pride you took in doing it as well as you could, or the shame you felt if you slacked off. The idea of work as a charisma, a divinely conferred power or talent, is probably the single most important concept I learned growing up as a Franco-American Catholic. It brought me through a number of jobs from age 16 to age 31 when I landed my first slightly prestigious position, sports writer for the Keene Sentinel newspaper. Before that, I worked as a store clerk, telephone equipment installer, janitor, gas pumper, enlisted man in Uncle Sam's Army, mill worker, hospital laundryman, orderly in a mental hospital, landscape laborer, and my favorite charisma, taxi driver. My mother died in 1994 at the age of 85. She called me from the nursing home where she lay crippled and said, I'm going to die tonight. Please bring the door and the girls. I was surprised when I came across her death certificate. I'd always known my mother as Jeanette Hebert. The death certificate listed her first name as Elodie. I pronounced that name the way it's spelled in English, Elodie. Maybe there's another way to say it. How did my mother say it? I don't know because I never heard her voice the name. I learned another of my mother's secrets when she was in old age. She often talked about her childhood where she cared for her father, who was disabled by a stroke. It was among her duties to eat meals with him because of brain damage. He would eat from her plate and she would eat from his. She recalled that one day she and her friends found him sitting on the ground several blocks from the internment house in Manchester, New Hampshire. They took him home in one of the kids' little red wagons. My grandmother, Elise Marcotte Vackhurst, supported the family working in the shoe shop. In her teen years, my mother liked acting in plays, and she talked about starting nursing school at Notre Dame Hospital in Manchester at age 23. One day the math came alive in my mind, and I said, "You never talked about the 5 years between high school graduation and nursing school. What were you doing during those years?" She shrugged and said, "I was in the convent." She belonged to the same order as Sister George, the Sisters of St. Joan of Arc. She couldn't bring herself to take those final vows in her 6th year, not because of a crisis of faith. She remained a devout Catholic all her life, but because she wanted a family. When she married my dad, H. Hebert, she was 31. He was 28. They were both virgins. They met at an estate in Dublin, New Hampshire, owned by a branch of the famous Cabot clan. My mother was what we call today a nanny for the Cabot children. I don't think she would have liked that word nanny. She was proud to be a registered nurse. H. was born in Keene on Wood Street, named for Smokey Joe, an old-time pitcher for the Red Sox. Nearby are Wagner Street, Cobb Street, Speaker Street, and Hooper Street. There are no Ruth and Goering Streets. Keene was never a Yankees town, but it was a Yankee town. We French, Irish, Italians, Polish, German, and Lithuanian Catholics were outnumbered by the Protestants. Keene might be a Yankee town of English speakers, but in the Hebert household of my parents on both sides, French was the favorite language. The Hebert name in my genealogy goes all over the place because my dad's mother was also a Hebert. My father had fond memories of his paternal grandfather, Alfred Hebert, who was a carpenter in Keene, though he was born in Canada. My father's mother died giving birth to my Aunt Teresa, and my dad was 13. My grandfather, Arthur Hebert, remarried a Yankee woman, which was how she was referred to in the family, a Yankee woman. And of course, she didn't speak French, so the cat language in the household transitioned to English. My mother was raised on the west side of Manchester, where the language of commerce as well as common speech was French. When my parents started dating, they found they had two things in common. Neither was a drinker, and they both grew up as Franco-Americans. My mother retaught my father the French he had lost when his mother died and his father remarried. French became the language of my parents' romance. So that was the language that they spoke in the home when their first child was born, me. When I started kindergarten in Keene at age 5, I spoke fluent French and only a few words of English. I don't remember this, but my parents told me that my experience with language in kindergarten at Lincoln School, where I was the only French speaker, was so upsetting to me that they decided to speak only English in my presence. The result, I never again spoke French, nor did so many of my friends with French names at St. Joseph's Elementary School in Keene, the only Catholic school in the area. I didn't know growing up that in the church politics of that time, my parish was considered to be an Irish parish. We had an Irish pastor, Irish curates, and the nuns at St. Joseph's, the Sisters of Mercy, were founded by an Irish woman, Catherine Macaulay. Not only were there no instructions in the French language, the word France rarely came up in the curriculum, and the word Quebec never. At home, in my family, in the families of my schoolmates, some of whom remain my close friends to this day, there were no discussions around the kitchen table about our French-Canadian heritage, no references on the school grounds either. It was a kind of ghost culture that we carried with haunted parts of our minds. It wasn't until I was in middle school that I learned from my friends that I wasn't the only kid at St. Joseph had a Bemere. The result for me was that though through some mental alchemy that to this day I do not understand, I killed almost everything I knew of the French language. Even when I studied it in high school and later in college, I just could not learn it. All I remember today is common expletives, intensifiers, and soft swears. I don't know what to call these expressions. I have no idea how to spell the words, so I set them down in this essay, close as I could in phonetic English. et motadzi batete josh la crotte chien. And I can count to 12. That's it. That's all I got left of my heritage. Yet that experience of dumping a language and replacing it with another seems to have helped make a writer out of me. For one thing, I was never able to pull out of my head cliched usage in English. I had to invent my own phrases. Also, early on, I paid attention to the way people spoke. I went out of my way to avoid talking like my relatives who spoke English with a French-Canadian accent. I didn't want to talk with a Yankee accent either, nor an Irish brogue, nor any kind of accent. I wanted to talk like John Cameron Swayze. You have to be of an age to recognize the name. He read the news on the Camel News Caravan sponsored by Camel cigarettes. Quote, I'd walk a mile for a Camel, unquote. And in case you didn't know, quote, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. My brother Tony's name is actually Omer, O-M-E-R, and T-O-N-Y is short for his middle name, Antoine. He's always hated the name Omer, and he was not so crazy about Antoine. Unless you wanted an argument, you called him Tony or Anthony, who was my mother's favorite saint, by the way. We had a little shrine in the kitchen of our house on 19 Oak Street in Keene. Its origins is a cuckoo clock. The cuckoo guts had been removed so that the face was open. Sometimes I wish somebody would remove the cuckoo parts of me. Then again, maybe without the cuckoo, there would be no me. Maybe cuckoo is as close a gift from the divine that I'll ever possess. Inside my mother's empty cuckoo clock was a plaster cast of St. Anthony, the patron saint of lost objects. My mother admitted that she had lost something of great value, and she prayed to St. Anthony for its return. But she wouldn't say what it was, and I never pushed her on it. In our family, there were more topics that you didn't talk about than ones you did. The idea was to keep the peace. It worked. I've never had a falling out with any family member. For example, I did not tell my devout mother that even as a child, I never had faith in the Catholic God, nor in any God. Let me make a distinction here. I am not an atheist. I'm not smart enough to be an atheist. Maybe there is a God. All I know for sure is that even if he exists, I don't have faith in him. My feeling is that if there's a God, he's a don't give a shit about people God. Maybe religious people come from a gene. Some people have it and some people don't. I don't have it. In the months before she died, my mom was bedridden in a nursing home with compression fractures in her spine from osteoporosis and untreatable and painful rheumatoid arthritis, which is one reason that I suspect that if there's a God, he's a don't give a shit about people God. My mother's mind remained nimble to the end, but not her body. I was very close to my mother in some ways. I was a mama's boy. I often went to her when I needed advice. The best thing she did to me was accept my future wife, Medora Lavoie. She embraced her like the daughter she never had. Medora grew up in Dover as a Lavoie, or is it Lavoie? I've heard the name spoken both ways. I speak it both ways myself, and so do Medora and her siblings. Depends on the occasion, the mood, the company. I was the executor of my mother's will, and in the days after her death, I handled everything with great confidence. I never broke down. Almost a year later, somebody sent me a review of one of my books. The reviewer, Jack Barnes, a Maine writer, happened to mention that Franco-American boys were often close to their mothers. When I read those words, I broke down and wept. I've been a professional writer for most of my adult life as a newspaper journalist, novelist, and teacher of creative writing. But the single piece of writing that means the most to me is a poem. I would like to read it to you. It's called My Mother's Donuts. On your deathbed, you told me the stems of the flowers I picked for you when I was a boy were too short to put in a vase. I didn't have the heart to tell you, you said. I remembered the smell of the sun on my clothes that you hung on the line on a hot summer day. And in the winter, the smell of the air from the clothes steaming off the radiators. You made donuts, I said. I remember the aroma, the heavenly taste when the donut is still hot from the boiling oil. In those days, people didn't tie their dogs, you said. Oh yeah, they came from miles around, drawn by the smell of your donuts. You always made the mistake of throwing them the holes. I couldn't help myself, you said. I laughed. You were too weak to laugh. And in the spring, when Dad burned the dead grasses, do you remember that smell? And the color of the new grass glowing through the black burn scar after the rain, the brightest green of the new season? There's no waiting for an answer. You shut your eyes. I go back in time, see myself picking flowers, boy's pure love for his mother, so brief. Tony and I are both named after priests. I am named after my mother's older brother by 14 years, the leader of our family, the Right Reverend Joseph Ernest Hebert. Everybody referred to Father Hebert as Father Vac, even after he was promoted to Monsignor. His lifetime ambition was to become the first bishop of French-Canadian ancestry in the Diocese of Manchester. Father Vac, who, by the way, is a young priest, likely married Grace Natalius' parents in Manchester, was deeply involved in the power struggle between the Irish Catholic and French Catholic church hierarchies in New Hampshire. The subject matter of their disagreements was the curriculum in Catholic schools. I'd like to digress for a moment. Interesting, isn't it? The identity language people used in those days, and those of us in my generation still. You had people calling themselves French who had never been to France, and you had people calling themselves Irish who had never been to Ireland, Poland, Italy, and so forth. The Irish had a strategy for assimilation, deal with the Yankee bosses in their own Americanized English language, while at the same time cherishing, sometimes inflating, and always flocking their culture as so-called Irishmen. In the dispute among New Hampshire Catholics over schools, the Irish position came to English only taught in Catholic schools, like the school I went to. Among the French clergy and intellectuals, the French language all by itself was the culture. So the Franco priests wanted Catholic schools to teach French as well as English and to preach in French from the pulpit. According to my mother, Father Vac favored a middle course between the two sides, though just what that course was never explained to me when I was a child, or maybe I just forgot or wasn't paying attention. I do remember that Father Vac's motto was, you can't live 1 foot in Canada and 1 foot in the United States. But he contradicted himself when he said over and over again that French was his favorite language. Anyway, the issue became irrelevant when Father Vac died suddenly of a heart attack at age 61 in January of 1956. I was 14 when Father Vac was found by a housekeeper nun at the Order of St. Joan of Arc, keeled over in his kneeler in his bedroom. Father Vac was my first mentor and also served as my father's figure when my dad was in the Navy during World War II. Father Vac's death was the single most traumatic event of my teen years. Father Vac wasn't like any priest I know of today. He never talked to me as if I were a child. He was the only adult who actually conversed with me. He was a hunter and fisherman with a huge gun collection. Tony and I used to play with his guns in the basement of the rectory at St. Edmund's Parish in the Penardville village of Manchester. He hid the ammo. Father Vac taught me the rudiments of boxing, and more important, infused in me combative attitude that served me well growing up on the east side in Keene. Father Vac's given name was Joseph Ernest Hebert. My given name is Joseph Ernest Hebert. A fact I never knew until I happened to stumble upon my birth certificate when I was in my 20s. I asked my mother, where did that Joseph come from? She told me that in her family, the firstborn son was always named Joseph, but he would be given another name to go by in public to prevent a confusion of too many Joes. Later I learned that the tradition in Canada was that all of the sons were named Joseph and the daughters were named Marie. Maybe so, but in my family, I'm the only Joseph among 3 sons. I find the idea of naming your alpha males after St. Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, kind of funny. Here's a guy way down on the priority list of the church and also apparently of the one true God, a beta male, a caregiver, a caretaker, a good provider, a perfect model of a working man of the Yankee nose. He never complained, but also never got to have a say, and from the accounts I learned growing up, never had sex with his blessed virgin wife. As for my last name, I grew up by Hebert. Eudora and I have spent the last 6 winters in New Orleans, where we're Heberts. I'm proud to have the Hebert name. I mentioned at the beginning of this essay that 1967 was a fateful year for me. It was fateful because 1967 was the first time I experienced pride in my name when I lived in New Orleans for 7 months, working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift as an attendant at DePaul Psychiatric Hospital in New Orleans. I was hired in part because Beth Green, the head nurse, liked my name. I heard the phrase more than once, Hebert. That's a fine South-Louisiana name. Nobody in my part of New Hampshire said Hebert. That's a fine New England name. A couple of years ago, a good friend gave me a T-shirt celebrating a river with my name in Nova Scotia, in the Grand Prairie region where my people come from, and where the river's name today is pronounced Hebert, the River Hebert. On my grounds, the Monadnock region of New Hampshire, I'm a Hebert, as in Ernie Hebert. He's a writer. I've been a Hebert or a Hebert far too long in Yankee land to make changes. It's kind of sweet enough to hear the name spoken the way it feels right, even if I have to travel 2,000 miles to New Orleans. Let me add that my youngest daughter, who grew up in New Hampshire as Nikki Hebert, now resides in Brooklyn, New York, where she's known as Nicole Hebert. I would like to hear your thoughts. My brother Tony, the second born of our household of 3 boys, was named Omer after a legendary priest on my father's side of the family. But he was long dead when my brother was born, and as far as Omer was concerned, he was stuck with an old-fashioned French-Canadian name he could not abide that his schoolmates made fun of. When my parents' third son was born, they named him Paul, a name a boy can use anywhere without self-consciousness. My mother used to call him Petit Pois, Little P. Sister George remains a vivid presence in my memory house, though I never really learned much about her. Like so many of my friends with French-Canadian roots, keen, I threw off the French language. Sister George reversed the language issue. While Sister George was a native-born American, she never learned more than a few words in English, park your ass. For me, Sister George is the embodiment of perhaps my greatest regret in life now that I'm pushing age 80, which was running away from my heritage. Father Vac's death when I was a teenager disturbed me for years. Poor grades in school, bloody fistfights, feelings of disassociation from the world I was growing up in. To this day, a grief hangs over me that I now believe that my loss, which I had always thought was in the figure of a person, Father Vac, is only part of a greater loss. Call it a confusion of tongues that I've been trying to define with this essay. Which leads me to an irony in the Vacris name. My great-grandfather, who I know as Giovanni Vaccarisi, migrated to Nova Scotia from La Spezia, Italy, and eventually ended up in Quebec, where his Italian name was given an EST ending and pronounced Vaccares. But as my mother recalled, growing up as Jeanette Vaccares in French ancestry, she was often reminded that Vaccares was not a real French name. When Giovanni's son, Jean-Baptiste, came to the States, his Frenchified Italian name was anglicized to Vacris. Father Vacris was quoted in an interview that the Vacris name was a misspelling of Vaccarisi. However, when I told my story to an Italian woman, she informed me that Vaccarisi is not an Italian name. It's likely that the document I saw with Giovanni's last name that Father Vacris believed was the correct spelling was itself misspelled. So then, Vaccares is not French and Vaccarisi is not Italian. However, Vacris is thoroughly at home here in the States, where foreign names are routinely discombobulated and recombobulated to fit the American language. I shut my eyes and I see my warrior priest, Uncle Father back. I see my earthly father, Ernest Hebert, a man with only 7 years of education who worked 45 years in a cotton mill, and who I never really knew until he lived with his last years in my house. I see my brother Tony, who, by the way, now likes to be called Antoine, so I count that as progress. I see my fictional character Howard Ellman, a foundling who, like his creator, did not know no claim to care about his past, who eventually learned in Spoonwood, Book 6 of the Darby novels, that his name was actually Latour, and his roots in North America came from old Acadia. In my books, Howard Ellman flips off the Latour name, but his son Frederick adopts the name, so his son Birch is not an Ellman. Birch Latour and his wife Tess will start a new family dynasty with the Latour name. As one who did not get his consciousness raised about his heritage until middle age, that's the best I've done in my fiction to set things straight. One winter day, when I was about 12 or 13, we had a sudden thaw and a heavy rain that flooded the church and school parking lot, which also served as our playground. That night, temperatures plunged, and the next morning, the water had frozen solid. I had a nice view of the frozen parking lot from my classroom upstairs. I watched as two nuns in their black flowing gowns and giant white bibs left the convent and started toward the ice. One appeared to be limping. As they came closer to my eye, I identified the limping nun as Sister Gregory, who had been my 6th grade teacher and a favorite of mine. The other sister gave Sister Gregory a push. Suddenly, she shot forward, spun, twirled, moved with dazzling speed. I thought for a moment that she would rise into the sky on the wind. Sister Gregory was on some ice skates. She navigated the entire rink with incredible grace. Something came over me I did not understand, but that was overwhelming and beautiful. The feeling was too good. We Catholics weren't supposed to feel this kind of elation in the earthly realm. I resolved not to tell anybody about it, afraid that somehow I had sinned with this new feeling. You see, even though I didn't believe in the Baltimore Catechism of God, I did believe in sin. It wasn't until years later that I realized that the feeling I had experienced was the feeling of falling in love. Jump ahead 2 decades, at a time when I was writing a piece about Sister Gregory for the Boston Globe op-ed page. Sister Gregory was in her 80s and had retired only a year earlier. She was living in a nice little apartment in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She was full of vitality with a somewhat sardonic outlook on the world that, of course, I would not have noticed when I was a boy. Well, of course I could skate. I'm from Berlin, she said, pronouncing pronouncing Berlin in the New Hampshire way. Here's the part relevant to my story today. She made a strong point that the sisterhood had been the right choice for her. She had only one quarrel with the church, the name that was given to her. My name is not Gregory, she said with emphasis. It's Isabel. I was on the drive home from that interview when I had a sudden image in my mind of my aunt, Sister George, the sweet little face, her black nun's habit, the pendant around her neck with the cross clutched in her hand. And I suddenly realized that I didn't even know Sister George's given name. Thanks to some research by my good friend Robert Perot of Manchester, I now know my aunt's name. It was Marie-Ann. That's A-N-N with an E at the end.
That's awesome.
That's it.
So again, our guest today has been Ernest Hebert, writer, teacher at Dartmouth College. Ernie, thank you so much for joining us on the show. This has been awesome.
Well, thanks for having me on your podcast. I think you're doing good work.
Is there an easy place to find your work if we want to be able to direct people to where they can buy your work?
Well, I think I only have one book in print right now, The Old American, which is one of my better books. I think they can get that one. But anyway, just a couple of weeks ago, I signed a contract with the Wesleyan University Press, which is going to reprint all 7 of the Darby books.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so we'll wait and see on that one.
Great. Well, all right. Well, thank you so much, Ernie. This is way cool.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.